An 82-year-old Korean War veteran was about to be buried with only the funeral director present. His lonely death seemed like the end of a forgotten story, but sometimes the most powerful tributes come from the most unexpected places.
This is Hammer and Tales. Let's get started.
Walter Dutch McKenna sat in his worn recliner at Sunrise Manor Assisted Living, staring out the window at a parking lot he'd memorized over the past 3 years. At 82, Dutch had outlived his wife, his brothers, his army buddies, and most of his memories. The only visitors he received were nurses checking his vitals and the occasional social worker asking if he needed anything. Dutch always said no. He'd been taking care of himself since he was 17 and enlisted to fight in Korea. Some habits never died, even when everything else was fading away. The small studio apartment was decorated with fragments of a life well lived but largely forgotten. A faded Bronze Star citation hung crooked on the wall next to a photo of Dutch in his army dress uniform, young and proud and ready to save the world. A dusty American flag sat folded in a triangle on his dresser, the kind they give families at military funerals. Dutch had no family left to receive a flag. His wife Margaret had passed 5 years ago after a long battle with Alzheimer's. They'd never had children, and Dutch's younger brother had died in a construction accident back in 1987. The few nephews and nieces he'd had were scattered across the country, living their own lives, probably unaware that Uncle Walter was still alive in a small town in Nebraska. Dutch didn't blame them. He'd always been the quiet uncle, the one who showed up to family gatherings but never stayed long, never talked much about the war or his feelings or anything that mattered. Margaret had been the social one, the one who kept in touch with relatives and remembered birthdays. Without her, Dutch had simply faded into the background of his own life. The only person who really knew Dutch was Carol Stevens, and she'd only met him 3 days ago. Carol owned Stevens' funeral home, a small family business that had been serving Millbrook and the surrounding farm communities for 30 years. She'd handled funerals for everyone from beloved grandmothers surrounded by dozens of grieving relatives to young people whose deaths shocked entire towns. But she'd never handled a funeral quite like Walter McKenna's. The call had come from Janet Rodriguez at the VA hospital. Dutch had suffered a massive heart attack while watching television Tuesday evening. The nurses found him peacefully in his chair, the remote still in his hand, as if he'd simply decided to change the channel and ended up changing everything. "We need arrangements made for Walter McKenna," Janet had told Carol over the phone. "He's got a VA burial benefit, so the basics are covered." Of course. When would the family like to schedule the service? That's the thing. There is no family. No emergency contacts, no next of kin, just us. Carol had handled plenty of small funerals, but never one with absolutely no family or friends. Surely there's someone, a neighbor, maybe some friends from church. He kept to himself, never caused any trouble, never asked for anything, just watched TV and did his crossword puzzles. What about military friends? Other veterans? We tried reaching out to the VFW and American Legion. A couple of guys said they'd try to make it, but they're all getting up there in age themselves. Carol scheduled the funeral for Friday morning and hung up feeling deeply sad about a man she'd never met. Over her 30 years in the funeral business, she'd learned that a person's funeral often reflected how they'd lived. Large, emotional services for people who'd touched many lives. Quiet, dignified services for those who'd preferred privacy. But a funeral with no one seemed like the saddest ending imaginable. Thursday afternoon, Carol drove to Sunrise Manor to pick up Dutch's personal effects and finalize the arrangements. The facility director, Mrs. Patterson, met her at the front desk with a small cardboard box. "This is everything," Mrs. Patterson said. "Some clothes, a few photos, his military decorations. He really didn't have much." "Tell me about him," Carol said. "What was he like?" Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. Quiet, polite, never complained about anything. He'd sit by his window most days, sometimes walk around the building for exercise. The staff all liked him, but he never really opened up to anyone. Did he ever talk about his military service? Not really. I know he served in Korea because of the paperwork, but he never mentioned it. Some of the residents talk about their war stories all the time, but Walter kept his to himself. Carol looked at the cardboard box containing an entire life. It's just sad that he'll be buried alone. Is there really no one coming? Maybe 2 or 3 people from the VA. That's it. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. He deserves better than that. Any man who served his country deserves better. Carol agreed, but there wasn't much she could do. She'd already called every veterans organization in 3 counties. She'd contacted the local newspaper hoping they might run a small story. She'd even asked her pastor to mention it during Sunday announcements. Nothing had generated any real response. That evening, Carol sat in her office at the funeral home, preparing for what would likely be the smallest service in her career. She'd arranged for a simple graveside ceremony with military honors. A representative from the VA would present the flag, and Pastor Williams had agreed to say a few words. It would be dignified and respectful, but heartbreakingly empty. Carol pulled out her phone and, on impulse, opened Facebook. She rarely posted about work, but something about Dutch's situation compelled her to share. Tomorrow, I'm conducting a funeral for Walter Dutch McKenna, an 82-year-old Korean War veteran who died with no family or friends to mourn him. He served his country with honor and earned a Bronze Star, but he'll be laid to rest with just a handful of people present. It breaks my heart that a hero will be buried so alone. If anyone in the area can spare a few minutes tomorrow at 10 a.m. at Millbrook Cemetery to pay respects to a man who deserved better, it would mean the world to me. Carol hesitated before hitting post. She wasn't sure it was appropriate to share details about a client, but Dutch deserved more than an empty funeral. If her small Facebook following could generate even a few additional attendees, it would be worth it. She posted the message and closed her laptop, hoping that maybe, just maybe, a few people would see it and care enough to show up. What Carol didn't know was that her simple post was about to set in motion something far beyond anything she could have imagined. Jake Morrison was scrolling through Facebook at 11 p.m., unable to sleep after a long day at his auto repair shop. At 54, Jake had been riding motorcycles for 30 years and belonged to the Iron Eagles MC, a group of mostly working-class guys who loved bikes and brotherhood in equal measure. Jake's thumb stopped scrolling when he saw Carol's post. The words Korean War veteran and buried alone hit him like a physical blow. Jake's grandfather had been a Korean War veteran too. Grandpa Morrison had come home from that war different, quieter, carrying invisible wounds that his family never fully understood. He died alone in a VA hospital in 1995, and Jake had always regretted not knowing him better, not asking about his service, not understanding what that generation had sacrificed. Without hesitation, Jake shared Carol's post with a simple message. Brothers, no veteran should be buried alone. This hits close to home for me. Anyone who can make it to Millbrook tomorrow morning should try. Jake belonged to several motorcycle groups on Facebook, not just his own club, but regional riding groups, veteran motorcycle associations, and charity ride organizations. He shared Carol's post to each one. Within an hour, the post had been shared dozens of times. Members of other motorcycle clubs saw it and shared it further. Veteran groups picked it up. Before midnight, Carol's simple plea had spread across Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, and Colorado. But Carol, exhausted from a long day, had already gone to bed. She had no idea that her post was spreading through networks of people who understood exactly what it meant to honor fallen brothers. Jake couldn't sleep after sharing the post. He kept thinking about his grandfather, about all the Korean War veterans who'd come home to a country that didn't really understand what they'd been through. Korea was the forgotten war, overshadowed by World War II and later by Vietnam. Maybe Dutch McKenna had been forgotten too, but Jake was determined that his funeral wouldn't be. At 6 a.m., Jake was already awake when his phone started buzzing with messages from fellow riders. His Iron Eagles brothers were asking for details about the funeral. Members of other clubs were confirming their plans to attend. The responses kept coming. Jake called his shop and told his employees he wouldn't be in until afternoon. Then he started his Harley and headed toward Millbrook, wondering how many others had made the same decision. Carol arrived at Millbrook Cemetery at 9 a.m. to oversee the final preparations. The cemetery crew had prepared the gravesite, and a small tent was set up with chairs for the expected handful of mourners. The honor guard from the local VFW was ready to present colors and play taps. Everything was in place for a small, dignified service. Carol checked her phone and saw that her Facebook post had been shared more than expected, over 100 shares with comments from people expressing sympathy for Dutch's situation. A few people had said they'd try to attend, but Carol wasn't expecting much. Social media support rarely translated into actual attendance. At 9:30, Carol saw the first sign that maybe this wouldn't be the empty funeral she'd feared. A pickup truck pulled into the cemetery with two elderly men wearing VFW caps. Then another car arrived with a woman and her teenage son. By 9:45, about a dozen people had gathered around the gravesite, more than Carol had expected, but still a small group for someone who'd served his country. Carol was arranging the flowers when she heard it. A low rumble in the distance, like thunder on a clear day. She looked up at the cloudless sky, confused. The rumble grew louder and Carol realized it wasn't thunder. It was engines. Multiple engines getting closer. Then she saw them. The first motorcycle appeared at the cemetery entrance, followed by another, then another. Within minutes, dozens of motorcycles were streaming into the cemetery, their riders wearing leather vests and patches identifying various clubs and organizations. Carol stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the parking area filled with bikes. The riders dismounted and began walking toward the gravesite, many carrying small American flags. "Ma'am, are you Carol Stevens?" A tall man with graying hair approached her. He wore an Iron Eagles patch and carried himself with quiet dignity. "Yes, How did you know?" "I'm Jake Morrison. I saw your Facebook post last night. Shared it with some friends." Carol looked around at the growing crowd of bikers, her eyes wide with amazement. "How many people did you share it with?" "Word travels fast in our community," Jake said, "especially when it comes to taking care of veterans." More motorcycles kept arriving. The cemetery parking lot filled, then overflowed onto the adjacent streets. Carol estimated at least 200 bikes, with more still coming. But what amazed her most wasn't the number of people, it was their behavior. The bikers moved with respectful quiet, organizing themselves around the gravesite without being asked. Many were clearly veterans themselves, evidenced by military patches and tattoos. Others were active duty service members who'd gotten permission to attend. At exactly 10 a.m., the crowd had grown to over 300 people. Carol had never seen anything like it. The small tent she'd arranged was now surrounded by concentric circles of mourners stretching back toward the cemetery entrance. Pastor Williams stepped forward to begin the service, but paused when he saw the massive gathering. "I prepared remarks for a small service," he whispered to Carol. "I don't think this microphone will reach everyone." Jake overheard and pulled out a portable speaker from his bike. "Will this help?" As Pastor Williams began the service, Carol found herself crying before he'd spoken 10 words. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude for what she was witnessing. "We gather today to honor Walter McKenna, a man who served his country with distinction and died without the family he deserved," Pastor Williams began. "But looking at all of you here today, it's clear that Walter did have family. He had the family of veterans, the family of people who understand service and sacrifice." The pastor spoke about duty, honor, and the bonds that connect those who've served their country. Then Jake stepped forward. "I didn't know Walter McKenna," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the speaker. "But I knew men like him. My grandfather served in Korea and came home carrying wounds we couldn't see. These men fought in a forgotten war, but they shouldn't be forgotten people." One by one, other veterans in the crowd shared brief words about service, sacrifice, and the importance of honoring those who'd given their youth to protect their country. When the VFW Honor Guard presented the folded flag, there was no family member to receive it. Carol stepped forward to accept it, tears streaming down her face. "This flag is given on behalf of a grateful nation," the honor guard said, "and on behalf of all the brothers and sisters who came to honor Walter McKenna today." As taps played across the cemetery, 300 people stood at attention, many with tears in their eyes for a man they'd never met but would never forget. After the service, the bikers didn't just leave. They approached Carol one by one, sharing stories of their own service or that of family members. Many left small mementos at Dutch's grave: military coins, patches, American flags. Jake was among the last to approach Carol. "Thank you for posting about Walter," he said. "Sometimes it takes a stranger to remind us of our duty to each other." "I can't believe all of you came," Carol replied. He would have been so honored. "Ma'am, in our world, we have a saying, 'No one rides alone.' That doesn't end when the ride is over." As the motorcycles began to leave, creating a procession that stretched for miles through the small town of Millbrook, Carol stood beside Dutch's grave and thought about the power of community she'd just witnessed. Her Facebook post had reached exactly the right people at exactly the right time. Hundreds of strangers had driven from multiple states to honor a man they'd never met, simply because he'd worn the uniform and deserved to be remembered. Carol kept the folded flag from Dutch's funeral in a place of honor at the funeral home. Whenever she encounters a veteran's funeral with little family attendance, she knows exactly who to call. The Iron Eagles MC and other clubs that attended Dutch's funeral have made it their mission to ensure no veteran in their region is buried alone. They maintain a network that activates whenever a forgotten hero needs honoring. Jake Morrison still has the original Facebook post saved on his phone. Sometimes he shares it again, not for Dutch McKenna, but as a reminder that the brotherhood of service extends far beyond military ranks and motorcycle clubs. In a small cemetery in Nebraska, Walter McKenna's grave is never without flowers or small flags left by visitors who never knew him but will never forget what he represented. His headstone, which might have been visited only by groundskeepers, is now a pilgrimage site for veterans and riders who understand that some debts can never be fully repaid. And Carol Stevens learned that sometimes the most powerful funerals aren't planned by families or funeral directors. They're organized by communities of people who understand that true honor means showing up when someone needs you, even if you'll never meet them, even if the only reward is knowing you did the right thing. Dutch McKenna served his country in Korea and came home to live a quiet, largely unnoticed life. But his death revealed something beautiful about the people who refuse to let heroes be forgotten, no matter how much time has passed or how alone they might seem. The rumble of 300 motorcycles that day wasn't just the sound of engines, it was the sound of a promise being kept. That in America, those who serve are never truly alone, and those who sacrifice are never truly forgotten.
Liked hearing this one? Hit that like button and subscribe to Hammer and Tales for more. Check out the next story on your screen. It's a good one. See you next time.